So the question was, how do I access the fifth dimension and what does shadow work have to do with the fifth dimension? So the reason that we want to do shadow work comes down to parts. So the Inside Out movies is probably one of the best descriptions I've ever seen as far as like what it's actually like to be human and the different parts of us and how those kind of all kind of come together to interact. And so if we have a negative thought and we're able to be in self, internal family systems, right? We're be able to be in that energy that is compassionate and creative and curious and clever and kind and just loves all the parts of us. When we're able to get in that part and be the observer of our feelings, the observer of our emotions, the observer of any feelings that we're having, especially big feelings, um, that helps us to be in control of what we begin to emote. After we gain that control and we can control how we're engaging in the outer world, then we continue to work on the control of how we're engaging in our inner world. And so when we're able to access self, self is already fifth dimensional. Self is already that higher aspect of us, think like Buddha-like or Christ-like, where you're able to tap into just this energy of unconditional love and respect. And if we're in that and we're observing the parts, that's the shadow work, right? Is working with the internal parts of us that were wounded in some way or over functioning in some way. So a shadow work question might be like, who am I if I'm not over functioning? Or how old do I feel right now as I'm feeling into this really big reaction that I know doesn't match this situation, which we're not going to know that if we're not in the observer. So part of the key to getting into the fifth dimension is to heal these aspects or these parts of you so that they can start to move into that higher energy. And so when we talk about in spirituality, it's important to come back to you. So anything that frustrates you in the outer world, come back to yourself, is because when we come back to ourselves and we do this inner healing work and we do our shadow work, then we are able to radiate a higher vibration, which then impacts the people around us. So when I'm radiating a higher vibration and in observer and healing my parts, eventually when those parts all get into that fifth dimensional energy and not having these old trauma reactions, not getting caught up into these fear responses or these narratives or feeling like I should be able to have some huge impact on the outer world, then I'm able to actually have more impact on the outer world because if I'm going inward and I'm raising my vibration and I'm working with the parts of me, then my whole universe of me moves up into the fifth dimension. If I still have parts of me in the third, fourth, and fifth dimension, then I'm going to be vacillating between those three dimensions. And so that's why it's so important for all of us to do our trauma work, our healing work, and why that has kind of people that maybe don't do that get spiritual bypassing, right? You can jump up there. You can have a psychedelic experience where you have a profound, deep experience that's very spiritual that moves you into a higher energy. But if you haven't done the work to get there naturally, then that you're not going to necessarily maintain that. Though I do see some benefit in having the experience so you kind of know what you're aiming for, because that can be helpful as well. So that's what the parts work. That's what, how do I get to the fifth dimension and hold it? You got to do the inner work and not spiritually bypass. And if you do spiritually bypass, fine. Like if that's your choice, if that's your journey, if that's the experience you want to have, but then you're going to be limited. So it's kind of like a guide in a reading the other day kept telling the client, choose your adventure. Her guide was not judging her at all. What was the question? Oh, the question came up of like, how come I'm having trouble like being in stillness? I can't like quiet my mind. And what her guides had said was that she used to have a lot of spiritual practices that involved movement and breath, and those were suddenly gone. She was no longer practicing those and was eating more junk food and drinking more alcoholic beverages. And um, so her vibration had actually lowered, and what she could access had actually lowered. So the stillness and the peace in the meditations that she had been experiencing before was gone. And I loved how the guides were not judging her. They were very much like, yeah, totally. Choose your adventure, and like, what experience do you want to have? And it's like in your own timing. And I think it was interesting because I think that actually was more motivating to not have any pressure put on it. It's just like, well, if you want to have that experience, you know that there are these things that help you be in the energy to support those expanded experiences, which ultimately, I suppose, is another variation of the question that I keep getting of how do I get into 5D? How do I hold 5D? How do I experience more 5D? And then I think the question comes up in many different ways in readings. And so I find it fascinating, the themes that guides kind of talk about. Another big one that's come up is like shame. So when shame like really gets you stuck, shame is meant for like big things like the e-files, or like, to prevent you from doing just absolutely horrific things, because shame completely binds you and says, you know what, you're all bad. And I think we have to be doing some really bad things in order for shame to be relevant for longer than a short period of time. Like shame can help us in little blasts or waves to learn not to like break a vase when we're a child, but immediately that repair, ideally, in healthy parenting is done immediately after any kind of shame is used in parenting to help the child to integrate that and come back into that homeostasis, to come back into that calm. And so when we're able to tap into that energy of guilt, I love guilt because guilt says, what behavior change do I need to make? What amends do I need to make? It helps us to really have an actionable step, right? So if I have not been doing my meditation practice, my breath practice, my movement practice, and I'm feeling shame about that, then I'm stuck because it's binding me. Shame is meant to bind and stop you so you can't move forward. It's meant to keep you from doing the most horrific things. But that's like where guilt comes in, right? And so guilt would just be like, yeah, you know what? I do need to make a behavior change. I've maybe been drinking a little bit too much, or I've been eating a little bit too much junk food. So those are two really actionable behavior changes that one could make to whether abstain from those things or reduce those things, whatever is in the journey. Because, I mean, again, there's no judgment. It's choose your adventure. What experience do you want to have? Do you want to experience the third dimension, the fourth dimension, or the fifth dimension? And we get to choose, but our choices impact where we're going to be in that energy. So if you feel shame, do your best to move that into guilt and sit down with those two questions. Now, if there's no behavior change to make, and there's no amends to make, no relationship repair, no boundaries to be put in place, then that shifts things a little bit. Then that it's completely manufactured, right? Maybe we have some other shadow work to do with a part of us to figure out like what is going on that I feel like this is wrong. And what can come up a lot with that is like family rules. And I know there's a lot of rules in my family that are not human rules to live by, that are not spiritual rules, that are not universal rules. They were rules that were passed down probably through generations. And so we grab onto these rules during hardships or hard times, and then we don't even look at them a lot of times. Then they just kind of pass down and keep getting lived out and keep getting experienced. And then it becomes like this rule. And But if I'm not really doing anything wrong, if I've decided, you know what, I'm not going to participate in that rule anymore, I no longer consent to that rule anymore, then we're removing our consent for that rule. We're setting a boundary for that rule. And then what can happen is people will feel a lot of guilt because it's like a part of them, a part that needs healed, is holding on to that rule and trying to protect them and help you or you to kind of come into compliance so that you can fit in with the family and for survival. But now in 2026, if you are an adult and not dependent on anyone else, then that may not actually be true for you. You may be safe and able to protect and provide for yourself while setting boundaries, or maybe not. And if that is the case, then it's exploring what do I need to do to be emotionally safe? What do I need to do to maybe make some changes in my life so that I have more freedom to make the choices that I want to make and set the boundaries that I want to set. So that is the answer to the question. I'm sure there's so many more, layers and different things we could talk about with that. So if you have questions and you would like me to answer them, please feel free to send me an email with your question and I will do a video.